Mr. Forgetful. It was one of those beautiful summer mornings that everybody likes to see. In Forget-Me-Not Cottage, the owner was fast asleep. Mr. Forgetful was having a dream. When the sun streaming through the windows woke up Mr. Forgetful. He yawned and stretched his arms and tried to remember what he had dreamed about. But of course he couldn't, because Mr. Forgetful can't remember anything at all, ever. Mr. Forgetful got out of bed and went to wash his face, but he'd forgotten where the bathroom was in his house. And do you know what he did? He walked into the wardrobe. Silly me, he giggled to himself. Eventually, of course, Mr. Forgetful found his bathroom and washed his face. He even remembered to clean his teeth. Then he went downstairs to make himself some breakfast. He toasted some bread, but of course he forgot about it, and it was bad. He boiled himself an egg, but of course he forgot about it, and it was half boiled. Mr. Forgetful had burnt toast and hard-boiled eggs for breakfast every day. It was such a lovely day. Mr. Forgetful decided to walk down the village to buy a stamp for a letter he'd written 3 weeks ago, but he forgot to post off, he said. And did he remember to shut the door of Forget-Me-Not Cottage behind him? Of course he didn't. Good morning, Mr. Forgetful, said Miss Parenko in the village post office. What can I do for you this fine morning? I'd like I've forgotten, he said. A stamp, suggested Miss Parcel, looking at the letter Mr. Forgetful was carrying. Yes, a stamp. That's what I was trying to remember not to forget, said Mr. Forgetful. Miss Parcel smiled. She's used to Mr. Forgetful. Mr. Forgetful had some more shopping to do, but he couldn't remember what it was. Suppose to remember not to forget to shop for. Of course he couldn't, so he decided to go home. On his way, he met the village policeman the other way. Will you give Farmer Fields a message from me on your way home, please? Farmer Field had a farm not very far from Forget-Me-Not Cottage. Tell him there's a sheep loose in the lane, said the policeman. Mr. Forgetful had never had a message to remember in his life before. There's a sheep loose in the lane, he said to himself. He trying to remember the message as he hurried along. There's a sheep loose in the lane. 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 Mr. Forgetful repeating the message over and over again over to himself. There's a sheep loose in the lane. Eventually, he arrived at the farm and found Farmer Field. Farmer Field, he said, there's a goose asleep in the rain. Farmer Field couldn't believe his ears. There's a ghost asleep in the rain, repeated the Field slowly. But I don't have any geese. There's a geese. And anyway, it isn't raining. Are you sure that was the message? Poor Mr. Forgetful. He'd got it all wrong. He couldn't remember how to get it all right. He simply couldn't remember at all. So off he went home. Poor Mr. Forgetful. Mr. Forgetful walked away from Farmer Field's farm, feeling very sorry for himself. I wish I could remember things, he thought. He was so busy feeling sorry for himself that he didn't see there was a sheep loose in the lane. He bumped into and fell over. Bother, said Mr. Forgetful. Bah, said the sheep. How silly letting a sheep loose in the lane, thought Mr. Forgetful. And then he remembered the message. He jumped up and ran back along the lane to the farmer and as fast as he could. Farmer Fields, he called as he ran into the farmyard. Farmer Fields, there's a goose asleep in the rain. He'd forgotten again. Mr. Farmer scratched his head. Come with me. Come on, cried Mr. Forgetful and pulled Farmer Fields back along the lane until they came to the sheep that was loose. There it is, cried Mr. Forgetful, pointing at a goose. And then he stopped. Oh dear, he said, that's not a goose, it's the sheep. That's a sheep, he blushed. I think, smiled Mr. Farmer, you're the goose. And he chuckled. Mr. Forgetful giggled, and Farmer Fields laughed. And even the sheep started to laugh. It was so funny. Later that day, Mr. Forgetful sat down in his favourite armchair in Forget-Me-Not Cottage to think about what a funny day he had been. But do you know something? He tried and tried, but try as he would, he simply couldn't remember anything that had happened. Oh, Mr. Forgetful. The end.